Thanks, Christy. It's great to be here today with everybody. We have a couple goals today. In the first panel, we really talked about the services that people get from nature. We talked about forests, we talked about coastal systems, we talked about urban environments. And our goal today for the second panel is to really dive deep and look at some very specific examples in those systems. So here with me today to help me do that is John Allan. He's with the state of Michigan, where he's the director of the Office of Great Lakes. Skiles, he's with DT Energy, where he's vice president of sustainability and environmental affairs. Kent Gilges, he's with managing director with Conservation Forestry, talk about some forest issues. And Kevin Shafer, who's the executive director of the Milwaukee, Wisconsin Metropolitan Sewage District. So thanks everybody for being here today, and I'm looking forward to kind of this next hour in this conversation. One thing we ended up with at the end of that last panel was this idea that Steve Pulaski put forth, is that we're really beginning to mainstream the idea of nature's benefits and ecosystem services. It's not just in the realm of the conservation realm, but we see it across all aspects, again, from investments we see in forestry to investments in green and blue infrastructure in cities to the operations of major corporations throughout the region. So how have you seen this kind of change? Have you observed this change over the past decade or so about this mainstream, John?
A couple of things come to mind. We touched on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative before, recognizing that there's a large economic drag that continues through the system from practices of the past. What we did to sediments, how we pulled so much wealth out so fast and didn't attend to the sort of the function of the system. And just the GLRI recognizes the need to clear that drag. It's really focusing on the R, that restoration side, to make sure that we understand how we're really recreating value. So I think that's one way we've seen that mainstream come back in. And another, on the corporate side, we see a very strong emphasis growing on corporate sustainability and how corporate sustainability is seeing the recognition of those co-occurring values, not competing values, but those values as they work together. So I think there's a couple of examples from different areas.
So it seems to me we can do a lot of reading, we can look a lot of news, and we hear a lot about GLRI and the Restoration Initiative and politics, but it seems to me the idea of nature's benefits and ecosystem services almost blows up our reliance upon the government support and expands our investments to all sectors of society. Are you seeing that, Kent?
I think in the investment side of the equation where we work, what we're seeing is a whole growth of investors that are interested in what some people call impact investing, or some people call ESG, environmental social governance. It's sort of this corporate social responsibility. They're looking for investments that are achieving multiple benefits. They need the return. They need to know that they're going to get their money back and they're going to get some economic value, but they're looking for something beyond that as well.
Right. So let's dive deep, and I think our job here is going to be actually dive deep in some of these very specific examples in our various sectors that we work in. In the first panel, we heard from John Fosgit about the values that forests provide for society. And I think, Kent, we talked before, and a big question is how do we keep forests as forests to ensure that they are providing those whole set of values, from the conservation benefits and the species and the plants and the animals to the recreational benefits to the driving the economy benefits. So how do we keep, or how do you think about with conservation forestry, how do you think about how do we keep forests as forests?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think Steve said it very well in the first panel, that the intermingling of economics and conservation are essential. That if we think about trying to protect forests and we aren't thinking about the economic uses of those forests, then the forest won't remain forests. And so our business was set up specifically to invest in timberland where we can generate returns to investors but manage it sustainably. And so the type of stuff that John was talking about, I think, is critical to long-term forest conservation, because in the end there isn't enough government money or philanthropic money to protect all the things we want to protect. So we've really got to focus on strategies that are just maintaining trees on the ground in good management.
So, John, we have a state here in Michigan who owns a lot of forest land. Do you see them thinking like this and thinking about how else or what kind of outcomes we're trying to get from our forest systems?
I think the state's always looking to find that balance. How do you balance production and productivity and timbering and timber harvest with a whole suite of values that people in Michigan want? And that's to be able to look at the forest, to be able to recreate in the forest, to be able to snowmobile and to ski through the forest, and the benefits that that forest gives in terms of absorbing water, absorbing carbon, all those other benefits that the previous panel talked about. Those are all compelling pieces. And we want to look at that as an and proposition, not an or proposition. And that does take, there's complications in those trade-offs.
Right.
Some people may want, all extraction all the time or a lot more extraction faster than that forest can produce. But we have to find what that balance looks like. Right. So I do see our Department of Natural Resources and our partners, and our private partners as well, really looking to understand how this happens. We saw pictures before, what happens when you just cut everything really quickly, right? And there was a lot of consequence to that. There was a lot of wealth created, but there was a lot of consequence in the short term. And we're really still understanding and clearing the consequence of that action. And we don't want to do that again.
So, Ken, getting back specifically some very specific forest conservation, I mean, John's talking about these long-term changes we see in forest, but we see changes today that are kind of barriers to getting those benefits. We see changes in land ownership and changes in land tenure. What do some of those patterns look like, and how are they affecting our ability to keep those forest systems operating?
Well, one of the biggest changes that occurred over the last 10 or 15 years is that a lot of the industrial timberland in the U.S. was owned by what we call vertically integrated companies. So the International Papers or the Georgia Pacifics, and they had factories that manufactured paper or whatever out of those forest products. Over the last 10 or 15 years, most of that land was sold, driven by Wall Street concerns, and it's now owned by timber investment management organizations. And the investors in those are pension funds and high net worth individuals and endowments. So a lot of our investors are teachers, firemen, policemen, and what we're obligated to do is to try to maintain value for them over the long term. But they also want to know that what we're generating is good conservation outcomes, protected land, strong, and high quality water and streams.
So can you take us to a specific example in the Great Lakes? There's some investments?
A good example we were involved in, we acquired 69,000 acres called the Goodman Forest in Wisconsin. It's up right near Iron Mountain. And we worked in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and with the state of Wisconsin. Governor Doyle at that time in Wisconsin really wanted to protect this because it was in between a state forest and national forest, and it had two very high quality rivers running through it. And so we worked with Governor Doyle, and Governor Doyle ended up acquiring 5,000 acres along those rivers, turned them into permanently protected wild and scenic rivers, and then put an easement, a conservation easement that restricted development on on most of that acreage. And so in the end, out of a 69,000 acre forest, 65,000 acres were permanently protected. They're ensuring that will be forest forever. But they're also maintaining products into the local mills. They're staying on the tax rolls, and they're open to public access for recreation.
And so you look for those values. Go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, we talk about forests, but we also need to think about how we drive the message home. We always talk about forests in the Upper Peninsula or northern Wisconsin. A lot of my constituents in Milwaukee have never seen Lake Michigan. They've never been to a forest. Yeah. So I think we need to also drive the message to the urban core as well. We need to bring people back to nature in these urban centers. Urban forests themselves are a big piece that helps with that. The green infrastructure that was discussed in the previous panel, just reconnecting the population centers with nature so that they can see the benefits in their backyard, and then they can see them up around the Great Lakes and around the country as well.
Yeah, it seems like that theme of connectedness, both locally, but trying to connect people to maybe a resource that's miles away. Now, when you get back to those investors, you said, those policemen, those fire, those teachers, they could be anywhere in the United States, anywhere in the world. Do they see that value? Do they see themselves as contributing back to the value of this greater resource?
I think they absolutely do. They want to know that their dollars are being invested in a way that's not destroying things. And so that, as most investors and most companies do, I mean, DT is a great example. They're managing a company, but they're also creating great environmental outcomes.
I'm sorry, so thanks for that example. I mean, it seems to me there's a few lessons to learn about what the kind of qualities you look for or the situations or the win-win or the characteristics of these projects you look for? And do you see some of those, Skiles? And we're going to dive into coastal here in just a second, but do you see some overarching patterns of the types of qualities you look for in a project when you choose to invest?
Sure, and I think it really works with great partnerships. We found that we can't do much of anything ourselves, and so we've looked hard at the forestry and reforestation as related to climate change, and the previous panel raised that issue, and so we've made huge investments. Huge, millions of dollars, in the sense of and planted a lot of forests, both here in Michigan and in the lower Mississippi Delta, where trees grow faster. So, but they've always been with Nature Conservancy or Conservation Fund. Then the property is then turned over to the Fish and Wildlife Service to manage. And so it only works with those kind of partnerships. And so we look for projects that put all those things together, and those are our best ones to make the investments in.
So let's transition. I think we have a video coming up that talks about, I think, those two themes, that connectedness and those partnerships and those public and private investments. And we have a video coming up that shows a major coastal restoration happening here in the Great Lakes. Focuses on Erie Marsh, just north of Toledo.
My name is Paul Pachowski, and I'm a charter boat captain out on Lake Erie. I go out fishing every day. I love to fish. I love to be on the water. I'm not a happy person unless I can see or touch the water.
It's impossible to separate fishing from the culture and economy of the Great Lakes, especially for those like Captain Paul, who make a living taking anglers onto Lake Erie. But declines in fish populations have made it harder and harder to catch the limit.
Back when I started this 30 years ago, anybody could go out there and catch their walleyes, just throw a lure over the side of the boat, put the rod over your shoulder, don't even pay attention, and the rod will jerk down and you'd reel up a fish. Now, in order to get your fish, you gotta be pretty much on your game.
Key to getting fish numbers up in western Lake Erie is restoring coastal wetlands. Over the decades, we've traded coastal development for habitat to the detriment of our economy and recreation. These days, 11% of all remaining wetlands in southeast Michigan are contained in the Nature Conservancy's Erie Marsh Preserve. So it's here that a major project is underway to restore what little habitat remains to maximize the benefit for all.
Coastal wetlands provide some storm dampening capacity, flood control. They filter water, and water that flows through them actually comes out cleaner once it's been through a wetland. So they provide clean water, they provide clean air, and they provide habitat for fish and wildlife.
Earthen dikes built more than 70 years ago disconnected the marsh from Lake Erie. The site is being re-engineered to re-establish that connection.
The purpose of the water control structure is to allow fish access into the marsh to provide additional spawning opportunity. And the fish passage structure will allow them free access to come and go and do their thing.
Coming into the preserve, into the diked wetland, there's more vegetation available. It provides a protected area from both predators and from the natural environment, meaning high winds and wave energy that can harm some eggs or young fish. So it provides foraging habitat, just a protected site for fish to use.
Another obstacle to restoring fish habitat at Erie Marsh is Phragmites, a plant that's familiar to most. You're likely to see it growing on the sides of roads and highways. But even though we see Phragmites at every turn, it's not a native species. Like Asian carp, it's an invader to the Great Lakes. And at Erie Marsh, Phragmites has room to take over. Growing so densely, it creates a green wall, literally forcing out all other life. This, in turn, forces site managers to go to great lengths to eradicate this pernicious plant.
We're spraying with herbicide, then we're either mowing or burning to get rid of the standing dead plant material. And then the key component is really to flood those areas. And the new pumps and water control structure and distribution canal will allow us to flood all the areas that are invaded by Phragmites up to about 2 or 3 feet, really drown them out to make sure they're dead. And then when we draw that water down, there's native species in the seed bank, and those will spring right up.
The rarity and importance of coastal wetland habitat to the Great Lakes sparked a $2.5 million investment into this site by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Given that Erie Marsh represents the 11% of wetlands in southeast Michigan, and as such is one of the largest left on the Lake Erie shoreline, we thought it would have significant benefits to restoring this area.
These kind of habitats can bounce back really fast. The habitat response is almost immediate. I've seen projects where we're under construction and water comes in a rainstorm and the birds are already there.
With a little bit of investment at this point, we can really get a big bang for our buck, and these areas just need a little push in the right direction before they spring back and they regain some of their historical quality and benefits.
And for lifelong fishermen of Lake Erie like Captain Paul, that can't come soon enough.
Lake Erie only has 2% of the water, but it produces 50% of the fish for human consumption that come out of the Great Lakes. That's a big number, and that's why this area is so important to not just protect, but to help flourish.
Thanks a lot. That was a great video. If I step back and if I just put completely my conservation lenses on and just think about conservation, Erie Marsh is a no-brainer to me, right? It's a great place for migratory birds, migratory waterfowl, shorebirds, spawning areas. It's a beautiful place, beautiful sunsets. But I also know that we mentioned an investment, a federal investment of over $2 million, approaching $3 million in the restoration. But I also know that some of our major corporations have invested in DTE, and specifically Skiles, DTE Energy has invested in the restoration of Erie Marsh. And thinking about Erie Marsh in the whole context of a coastal system throughout western Lake Erie. So why would a corporation like DTE Energy invest in these types of restorations and this type of conservation vision?
Well, basically there's two reasons. And the first one is broad, and we're a gas and electric utility that's located here in the Great Lakes. And all of our employees are located here in the Great Lakes. And we want to attract businesses to come into the area. And so all those things, our employees are, they hunt, they fish, they enjoy the nature. They want us to do the right thing as a corporation in order to feel part of that. We want more businesses to move into the area. We can't go other places.
Yeah, I think Amanda mentioned that in the first panel about this quality of life side of things.
Absolutely, and so Michigan is fantastic in the resources that we have and the potential that we have to attract people, and so that's very important. So that's kind of the broader sense of it. So we do a lot of investment through our foundation. I think if you think about the last year or so, we've spent about $1.5 million, roughly spread over 30, 35 different organizations to partner with again, but to help that broad sense. In addition to that, there are individual specific issues that are important to us. As the environmental guys, sometimes we have to protect our facilities from the environment, and there's invasive species and things like that that we're interested in taking care of. And
so do you see specific implications or impacts of things like Phragmites or zebra mussels on your facilities and operations?
Absolutely, and that's part of why we have partnered with you and others to try to remove some of that. It goes all the way to security. We have a nuclear power plant, and to keep the Phragmites down in that surrounding area is important.
So you have a view
just
in the
for
view
that.
shed, yeah.
And so it goes. It's very broad. Climate again is another issue that we've invested heavily because we're trying to figure out ways that we can address the issue, address it as people want us to, and do it in a low-cost manner to our investors.
Yeah, John.
I want to pick up on this theme of connection because I think this is really critical. We've talked about connecting or reconnecting natural systems, rivers that flow, but we've also really focusing on how people connect to those resources. So we've seen efforts at the federal level under GLRI. We've seen efforts on the state through state management plans, through timber management plans with our DNR and the management of state lands. But what I wanted to also mention is I travel around the state a lot, and I see community after community expressing their desire and their hope through just an inordinate amount of personal effort at the community level. We see this in Monroe and in the River Raisin system. We see this in Muskegon, and I'm not going to mention all the communities, but we see this in Alpena, we see this in Marquette. Community after community have realized this value proposition. They've realized this value, that their face to the water just has inordinate value for them. Corporations are seeing that, and how we really reconnect that, and how communities and individuals and volunteers as well are just giving their heart and soul to recreate this relationship that they have with something that they hold so dear.
Right.
There's an economic proposition, but there's an aesthetic proposition, but there's a human emotional proposition here too, that helps drive people's choice. And it's really ultimately around then choices that people make to continue to grow businesses, to choose to put businesses here, to think about how they're connecting with their family. And it's really through those experiences that will ultimately drive that long-term stewardship. So what happens there at that narrow level ultimately drives experience, which I think drives stewardship.
So, Skiles, can you dive back into some of the specific examples that are driving that stewardship of the resource, and why? What are the benefits that, obviously we can think about the benefits nature's getting, but what are the benefits that you are getting as part of DTE Energy?
Well, again, I'll first go to the personal, and I'll give a story of my CEO who has young boys. And when we first started looking at forestry and reforestation, his boys were sitting there watching some nature show on TV with him, and he says, "Well, what are you guys doing, Dad?" And he came in the next day and said, "What are you doing?"
What are you doing, Skiles?
And so it gets personal all the way to the top of the company. But beyond that, I mean, things don't always work. And I keep going back to the climate issue. When we were talking at Cap and Trade program a number of years ago, we started looking at reforestation, and we made a lot of investments. We worked with a lot of partners, but it really wasn't coming together. So I think the previous panel talked a little bit about policy, and we haven't started thinking in the right way on policy. We have a lot of engineers and a lot of lawyers that work on these things, and they think of the law, and they think of in some manufactured solution to things. But we haven't yet switched over to really taking advantage of the environment.
Yeah.
I think we need to do that.
Right. So I think this policy bump or barrier is interesting. Do you find either in your business in conservation and forestry and your dealings in the municipal sector that, I think in the first panel we mentioned something along the lines was like maybe the science is a little bit and the partnerships are a little bit ahead of the policy. But are you seeing some barriers to thinking differently that have limited your ability to do either forest conservation deals or implement municipal infrastructure ideas?
I'll jump in. I think one of the barriers we see is the lack of understanding in an urban core of why you would want to put a green roof on a building, or why you would have bioswales and rain gardens and porous pavement. So it really gets down to looking at the multiple benefits of what some of these different nature mimicking of nature that we are looking at. How does that benefit the individual? The urban forest that I talked about earlier. Why is that important to people? And it goes to the economics as well. We went into one of our watersheds, Lincoln Creek, and removed all the concrete lining from that creek that my predecessor engineers put in place in the 60s, and naturalized the waterway. We put in green infrastructure throughout, and now we're seeing property values in that watershed go up by about 20%.
Wow.
So we need to talk about, the economics. The climate change is a huge issue. And we really need to talk about just that core, what John was saying, the emotion that it brings to people, because they really do connect with nature.
And the other thing is we really need to connect, as John said, and I think sometimes in our cities, we've lost some of that connection.
We have.
Talked to people when I'm old enough that whenever I was a little kid, if I was inside the house during the day, my mother said, "Are you sick or what?" And get outside. And we don't do as much of that. So we really need to do some things to educate and connect our city people to the environment, whether it's urban forestation or just getting them out into the surrounding areas.
Sean, one thing I think you mentioned when we were talking a little bit earlier was this a little bit of asymmetry and again this disconnectedness that maybe a restoration here or a restoration on the shores of Lake Erie near one of your facilities. There's a disconnect between doing that some of the restoration and the benefit that it might provide somebody, as we talked about earlier, somebody who lives downstream or somebody that's upstream in the forest. And so how do we deal with that kind of asymmetry or that disconnectedness?
We've been exploring this for actually quite a while. So what currency do you use to compare like things or dissimilar things? So part of that asymmetry, as you mentioned, is that humans generally tend to value the same amount of gain and the same amount of loss differently. We've actually valued the same amount of loss more strongly than we would value the gain. If I find $10 on the street, I feel pretty good about that. If I lose $10 by the end of the day, I actually feel worse off had I not gone through that transaction. So there's a bit of asymmetry of what we think we gain and lose. But there's also an asymmetry when we're trying to compare things. For instance, growing up, if I saw that you had a go-kart and I really wanted a go-kart ride, what am I really willing to, what's the value proposition for me for that go-kart? Can't trade you a go-kart ride. Right. I may trade you baseball cards. So there's a real asymmetry in what we're trading, but we both see some value in that. I think sort of nature services is also, how do I value, 10 acres of wetlands versus, the ability to use water in irrigation or for something else. So really trying to understand what the deeper value proposition is in nature is an inordinately difficult problem. We can put a cash value on it at some level, but we're also still trying to learn how to do that. What is the value of the ability of water to infiltrate into the ground and store that water for when I want to use it later when the season is dry and I need to put that on a crop? What is the inherent value of that? And how do I value a green infrastructure project versus something I know easily how to value, and that's the size of a pipe, the type of concrete, the depth of the ditch, and the amount of water I need to move. I know that cost and value. I'm not sure I can capture yet all the values that green infrastructure gives me.
So one thing I struggle with oftentimes is how much information do you need to make those decisions? Because you're making investment decisions in forestry. You're making decisions in green infrastructure, and you have to. There's aging infrastructure. Things are going to cause a problem if you don't replace or repair. So how much information do you feel with? When do you feel comfortable? Because decisions have to get made no matter what.
Decisions do have to get made. And I really think with green infrastructure, it's just common sense. I mean, a lot of these things, you want to put a lot of science and a lot of research into it, which I think you need to do. But on some of these things, if I can put a rain barrel on a downspout and hold 55 gallons of water, that's 55 gallons of water that's not going somewhere else. And you can use it later during a drought. So I think some of it's just common sense. In Milwaukee, we just jumped in. We said these are the right things to do. They help the environment. They help the economy. They improve the quality of life. We're going to do it, and just started investing.
Yeah. So I think what we'd like to do is skip to another video here where we talk a little bit about the green infrastructure as an example from Cleveland, and then we're going to dive in and specifically talk with Kevin about some examples from the city of Milwaukee.
The Environmental Protection Agency keeps a long list of cities, each with a gushing problem. The list has 772 names, big cities and small towns. Their problem? They've all got combined sewers.
That is the sanitary sewer that carries the water from your toilet and connects to the storm drain. When there's a big rain, they combine. The sewer system can't handle it. The excess pours into the river or the lake. Gross. But that is a combined sewer overflow. And for the health of Lake Erie, we better do something about it.
So if it's raining, it's a big deal. Here in Cleveland, we're spending $3 billion over the next 25 years just to fix it. $3 billion going into one big hole in the ground. Well, actually 7 big holes. East of downtown, they're digging the first of these, called the Euclid Creek Tunnel. There's a rock chopping machine at the bottom of that shaft, cutting a tunnel 24 feet in diameter and 3 miles long beneath Lake Erie.
Just has a massive cutting head on it with a lot of teeth on it, or bits, that will rotate slowly and start to pulverize and chew into the rock.
That's some of the rock after it's been chewed up.
So when these are fully erected, they would be 360 degrees.
They've got 2 more years to go before this tunnel can act as a giant holding tank for sewer overflow until the nearby treatment plant can process it.
I think that this project is amazing, but it's going down below where no one will ever see it, but all will benefit from it in the end by improved water quality.
As big as this tunnel is, it can't hold all the combined overflows. So the sewer district needs everyone throughout the watershed to get involved and to help.
The best way to do that, think about this simple concept, perviousness. While most things in the city are impervious, pervious things soak up the rainwater before it hits the storm drain.
The question of perviousness and imperviousness is just about pavement. You know, when human beings move into a place, the first thing we do is we pave things and we build structures. And so when the rain falls, it can't follow the sort of natural pattern of soaking in and returning to the waterways. Instead, it cheats off into the sewer system.
Urban planner Terry Schwartz is in the Lower Kinsman neighborhood, the Forgotten Triangle, where there aren't many neighbors left. It's a problem area for causing sewer overflows. It's so impervious around here. With all the grass where houses used to be, you would think that would help catch more of the rainwater. But you'd be wrong.
But unfortunately, the demolition process leads to a lot of soil compaction. So even though we have more and more vacant land, a lot of it isn't really helping in terms of the runoff.
Solutions are in the works, creating what's called the green infrastructure. Here, urban farms break up the compacted soil, catch some of the rainwater, and make food instead of sewer overflows. Over at University Circle, a new hotel is growing up. Green infrastructure? It's in there.
So this is the pervious paver that is being used for the driveway and the parking lot area here.
Pervious pavers let the water get down to the sand underneath. That's an estimated 1 million gallons of water that won't get into storm drains from this 1-acre site every year.
You know, it's sort of a smarter design as opposed to just throwing down some asphalt and striping it and putting cars on it.
Help cutting down on overflows isn't confined to downtown. 5 miles as the crow flies from Lake Erie in South Euclid, an urban marsh now helps to cut down on runoff. 5 years ago, this was an ugly stormwater retention basin. Now, it's a green infrastructure showcase. You can see it from Victoria and Norbert Cohn's tea house.
Before the wetlands was developed, it was an apocalyptical wasteland of concrete and field grass. And in the summer, it was burnt out. It was just barren. It didn't seem to make sense to people why it was there or what it was doing.
This is the old Langerdale catch basin, and it would overflow and flood neighborhoods, ruining stuff in people's basements. The city decided it better do something.
And the idea came up of an urban marsh, to actually look at how to use nature and use those techniques to actually clean the water tributary and handle the stormwater management.
You feel like you're in the country now. Like you're in the woods and you're in the city.
The urban marsh is a lovely piece of perviousness the sewer district wants to see more of. Plus, it's adding to the economy. Property values around these types of green spaces typically go up. And Victoria's Tea House, well, you'd better make a reservation for next year because it's booked up through this season. Makes you wonder why everyone just doesn't go pervious.
We have to do what we have to do to solve problems. But the hope is we can create solutions that blend in with community objectives. Whether it's urban farms or other economic development opportunities, there's ways to do this. Control stormwater, but still create something for the community. And we're going to look aggressively at that aspect.
Thanks. That was some great examples of investments we can make in the urban infrastructure that, again, provide the multiple benefits from attracting people back to these places, from providing business opportunities, and again, providing the natural benefits that we all like to see. The Nature Conservancy is doing a small study with Grand Valley State University looking at the relationship between Phragmites, as we talked about earlier, and property values. And again, we begin to see a relationship. There's a relationship emerging where you see these invasive species are actually decreasing property values. And so I like, Kevin, what you said at the end of our last little bit was some of these decisions are pretty clear and not that hard to make. They just make sense. Milwaukee has a long history of investing in kind of blue and green infrastructure. So can you take us back to how that emerged in the 80s or 90s?
Well, some of that was before I was there,
That's
but
right.
yeah, in 1993 we put on our first tunnel online, so it's been operating for 20 years. And we reduced our combined sewer overflows, which you just heard them talking about, from 50 down to 2.4. So we're well within our regulatory limits. We are doing much better than the feds and the state tell us to do with our overflows. But that was during, that went online in 93. I came to the district in 1998. And we saw people still wanting more. They wanted to enjoy the rivers more. They wanted to connect to the rivers more. They wanted to be part of nature in that urban core. And so we looked at it and we said, we could continue building pipes, we could continue building tunnels, but the issue is not so much what we are overflowing, it's our connection to nature. So we really changed our approach in the early 2000s. We said we need to be more of take a greener approach to how we move forward with these issues. And so we initiated in 2001 a green seams project where we're purchasing buffers way upstream in the watershed outside my sewer service area, getting my public to understand that what we spent our municipal dollars on upstream helped them from a flooding standpoint, from a nature standpoint. We've got over 10 acres of green roofs installed today. We've been doing this for the last 11, 12 years. We've got porous pavement. We've got over 18,000 rain barrels installed in the area. So we've really driven the message. Before the message was, okay, what's the city going to do? What's the suburbs going to do? We're driving the message down to what are you going to do in your backyard? What can you do to help? And it's really helped connect that whole message. Again, what I talked about before with urban forests, bringing it down to the individual and saying, this is what you can do to help. And don't always rely on government because there's not a lot of funding. We're not going to see that funding anymore. But there's very simple, low-cost things that the homeowner can do or the business can do. And it helps everyone.
So you mentioned those CSO results you're getting. What other results are you seeing? Are you seeing the improvement in water quality? Are you seeing the more fishable and swimmable streams?
Well, we're not too fishable, swimmable yet, but we are more fishable, swimmable. And that's going to be kind of an elusive goal as we move forward. But we are seeing the waterways improve. We're seeing fish migrate back up the waterways where before the rivers were just dead. Nothing lived there. And we did it to ourselves. So we learned from our mistakes and we moved forward. We built the tunnel. We reduced overflows to 2.5. We're starting to see, we're taking the concrete out, so we're starting to see salmon migrate back up the waterways. In Lincoln Creek, the watershed I talked about before, we spent $119 million, that upfront cost that was talked about in the first panel, removed concrete, naturalized the waterway. And the first year after it was completed, the salmon started migrating upstream. And they would go upstream and die. And all of a sudden the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, calls us and says, we have all these dead fish, what do we do? And we said, well, that's neat.
That's what salmon do.
That's what they're supposed to do. So it was a problem that we weren't planning on, but it really brought people back to why we're here and what we do, and that inner emotion for the environment.
So it's interesting to me is we all have certain stakeholders that we interact with a lot, investors, in your company or the residents of the state. So are these stakeholders getting it? Are the people that are supporting you, are they getting it? Are they seeing these values?
Every community that I visited, I think I mentioned a little bit, we're just seeing huge hope and huge desire and huge effort within communities to connect, whether that's businesses, whether that's individuals, or churches or conservation stewards. They're seeing this relationship and they're really working towards their own strength of their own community. They're doing the work, whether it's a rain barrel or coming out with a shovel and helping restore their system. We saw a long period of time where we pulled a lot of wealth out of the Great Lakes, from the beaver through timber, through ores and other things, and there's still capacity to create that wealth. But we're also looking at the capacity to use that wealth in the perpetuation of the very thing that we find the most valuable. And that's the relationship and the ability to continue that in perpetuity. We see that on the forest side. So I think people are getting that. I think we're going to see that this is our period of time. These decades that we're in right now, we're going to look back and say, we started something to re-put something back in place that people have great value, and I think people are seeing the value proposition in this.
So Skiles, the Nature Conservancy is working with DT Energy kind of in Western Lake Erie, trying to develop the set of choices you can make in which to invest. Why is that so important?
Well, I think, are stakeholders getting it? I think yes, they're getting it, but I think we're still in the infant stage.
Right.
And we're just starting to get it. And I think it's organizations like the Nature Conservancy that can really help us and help businesses, help individuals. And to the project that you mentioned, you know, is really to identify, okay, we want to work in Western Lake Erie. What are all the things that we need to do in that area that connect to the people, that take care of issues like the Phragmites? And, you know, identify those so that as a business, you know, we're an energy company. We're good at delivering energy, but, you know, we're not experts in that. So, you know, we look to groups like yours to help us. And I think a lot of businesses are the same way, is, you know, give me multiple choice and, you know, and I'll go out and do a lot of things. But, you know, we don't have the resources or the expertise necessarily to go out and identify those opportunities.
So we kind of, I think, talked about those resources and the availability of those resources. You deal a lot with that private investment, but where do you see that kind of combination of public and private investment, and the importance of that, and where it could be going in the future?
That's a great question, because the public financing is such a critical component to most conservation deals at some level. It doesn't have to be all of it, it just has to be a piece of it, and then you use that to leverage with private philanthropy, and you leverage that with private investment dollars. And then you can go out and do large projects, but without kind of a core of conservation funding, it gets very difficult. I think the other thing to think about is I sort of pull out my crystal ball and try to look into the future in conservation. Water is critical. Right. And people's willingness to pay for water, the sort of New York City project has now been replicated in Raleigh, North Carolina, and in other places like that. And water funds for the provision of clean water become a way that Kevin can get his job done, because the ratepayers will pay to protect upstate in the watershed. And that ties into the people that are managing the forest.
So where do we, I guess, Kevin, where do we see that creativity come from, those ideas about, you know, we could just try this, we could establish a water fund, you know, what if it doesn't work? You know, so where do we get that creativity? Where do we get those ideas? Where do we, you know, are we able to take those chances?
Oh, sure. Well, the great ideas come from my staff. They come from neighborhood groups. They come from the community themselves, just bringing in new ideas and thinking differently. One of the benefits, you're asking about the benefits to a company of going green with some of these issues. The benefits that we've seen is phenomenal staff, young folks that really want to have a say in what their environment looks like. So I see the ideas coming from all sources, that whole partnership, collaborative approach that we talked about earlier. If they don't work, then I get blamed for it, and that's okay. But you know, we need to try new things. We need to show that some of these things don't need to cost $1 million or $2 million. They can be done on a very cost-effective local level.
John,
I think we're still inventing here. I know Skiles said we're in the infancy, and I agree. We see great capacity, and people are understanding this, but I think we're still inventing our way into this in some ways. For decades, we understood sort of how to start to deal with the point source world, and now we're really trying to understand both the non-point source world in terms of stress, runoff, and those kinds of things, and stormwater management, and we're still inventing those mechanisms. So how do you capture the value that this brings back to all of us, and use the value that brings back to all of us to actually support the system itself? We're trying to learn how to create that loop. How do you use nature to create value, to create wealth, to create jobs, to create community, to create culture, to connect people, and then use the ability to increase that wealth to actually service those things that created it in the beginning. We're what we used to see as a very linear, system, front to back. We're trying to figure out how to turn that loop and say the very value that we're creating is being turned back on itself to service the very thing we love the most.
I think that's a great point. I'd like to add on to that. The idea that creating value and being able to put a value on something in a market enables the innovation and creativity of everybody to say, okay, maybe I can create a business out of this. And I think we need to focus on that, is that regulatory structures may not provide solutions, but markets and people focused on innovation that can benefit from that will.
We also have to understand that this may not be the #1 priority for Joe citizen. You know, they got to put food on the table, they got to get a job, keep a job. And so this falls down on that priority list. So what we need to do is what the first panel talked about, try to connect the dots that says this does impact the food on your table, this does affect your job, it does affect the economic vitality of the community and of the watershed. So we really got to drive the message home.
Skiles, any closing?
Yeah, well, I think it always gets back to partnerships. That I think, you know, none of us have all the answers, none of us have all the resources, the expertise, but if we all start thinking this way, we really have a tremendous opportunity. And, you know, nature's been around a long time and they're great at it. You know, it's great. So, you know, it knows how to do it, and all we have to do is make use of that.
Yeah, I think getting back to Steve's idea was like kind of mainstreaming these ideas. And even though we might be at just our infancy in that, you know, we might be able to bring John back 10 years from now. How are things going to look different if I get you back on stage here in 10 years? Besides us.
A little more makeup.
I'm always incredibly hopeful because I think we're thinking through the hard work of how to do this. I think we're going to be proud that we started this work, maybe a little frustrated that we didn't start it earlier, and maybe a little frustrated that we didn't go fast enough, because there's always faster, right, in terms of the world we live in. But I think we're going to look back and say, we did the right thing, we're doing the right thing, and we're thinking about it the right way.
I hope so too, but I gave you guys some easy questions. Now we're going to go to a couple audience members that are really going to give it to you. So go ahead.
Good morning. My name is John Hardigan. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and my question for the panel is, what can a consumer do to make a difference in the purchasing choices they make every day?
Buy local, conserve water, which is really hard to talk about in the Great Lakes because we have so much of it. We're really spoiled with the great water supply that we have. So, you know, the consumer can buy local, they can look at the type of products that they buy, what those impacts might be on the environment, and then try to conserve water.
Right. Demand a product that has the amenities that they want to see in that product. If it's corn flakes, how was the corn grown? Right? If it's another product, how was that product produced? If it's a wood product, was it certified? You know, did it come from a place that had? Does it come from the place that has the values that I have? That's the question consumers need to ask themselves.
Right. Yeah. And as an energy company, you know, it's energy efficiency. You know, be efficient in everything that you do. Right. And that's, you know, tough for us because we make money selling quantity. But now we have a way in Michigan to make a little bit of money conserving.
And actually saving water is saving energy.
Absolutely.
We spend a lot of money in this country and in this state on the energy side of just moving water around. The more water you save, water's, you don't save water because the same amount of water is here as was, but you really ultimately save energy in that proposition.
That's right.
So next question.
Hi, this is really an awesome program. Thank you for taking my question. I'm Marie Donegan. I'm the Executive Director of the North Oakland Headwaters Land Conservancy. And we've been preserving land in the headwaters of the Clinton, Flint, Shiawassee, Huron rivers for the last 40 years, 1,400 acres to be exact, which is great for a small volunteer land conservancy. And we want to be your partners, and we believe that we are the NGO, or one of the NGO solutions for land conservation and environmental protection. And we are, as you said, boots on the ground. But we are also small fish in a very big pond, and so we want to know, or I want to know, how can we, our small, volunteer, underfunded land conservancy, become a bigger, part of the solution, be a bigger part of this whole picture?
Let me start, and I'm sure others have a feeling. So the land conservancies, each individual one sort of reflects their place. But you also act in concert with a variety of other land conservancies and through your organizations like Heart of the Lakes and others that really sort of help amplify your voice. So it's really understanding not just how to make that work within your place, within your community, but how that voice does amplify up and connecting to that bigger body of work. So we see that, plus it also, specifically in the conservancy side, it also resonates with a breadth of individuals. And I think that's an important piece too. It's a very important voice in how people see themselves in their land. So even though you're small and even though you feel underfunded, I'm going to continue to encourage you to do that hard work because people see that work and they see it play out in their community. And I think there's important value there.
Sorry, I think it goes back to something Kevin said earlier, which is tying people in the urban core into natural areas. Right. And local land trusts working in an urban environment are creating sort of the future, the kids that are going to value this stuff in the future.
Right. I can tell you what we did in Milwaukee. We've got the Green Seams program. We're a bunch of engineers. We don't manage land very well. You know, that's not our forte. So we work with the different non-environmental groups, Land Trust, Ozaki Washington Land Trust, River Revitalization Foundation, Mequon Nature Preserve. We purchase the property, we put an easement on it, and then we turn that property over to the Land Trust and they manage the property.
And I'm sorry, I think we have one more question waiting here from
Dwight Washington. This is a short question, and there's been a lot of talk about putting value on the water, and that's something that's hard to do in the Great Lakes region. And so it brought to my mind that one of the natural resources in Alaska, oil that's used, that people in the state get compensated for being citizens there. And I was wondering if there's ever been any discussion or talk about compensating people from Michigan to be conservative, to be efficient and with water usage.
Good.
Boy, that's a panel discussion.
That's a good question. I think it's one of those challenging creative ideas is where we throw some of those ideas out, borrow these ideas.
I would say it's a bit interesting, quite frankly, that most people don't pay for water. You pay a water bill, but people don't pay for water. I mean, the community puts a well down, and what you're really paying for isn't the water, you're paying for the infrastructure necessary to support that water. So we have a long legacy of actually not paying or not putting an actual price on the water itself. We have a reasonable use system in Michigan that says people's use is reasonable. We end up paying for water industrially. But we pay for the infrastructure to support it. But the notion of how do you service that becomes very important.
Well, thank you all very much today. It's been a great discussion. You never know where it's going to go. We started talking about forests, which some people wouldn't expect too much to hear in the Great Lakes, and we actually even got the go-karts and baseball cards. So I think it's really interesting. I'd like to see these kind of patterns that emerge, and it's obviously this connectedness between habitats and places and people, not just what's just adjacent to you, but what might be hundreds of miles away. And this idea of these values and these partnerships, it's connectedness both to nature, but connectedness to one another. So again, thank you very much. Great discussion today, and now back to Christy.